Hi everyone, how are you all? I hope you are always healthy and happy. This time Sokka movie will tell you about the 2013 film After the Duck. It tells the story of a group of students who conducted a training after a nuclear apocalypse and had to survive and maintain human existence on Earth, where they chose Indonesia to be the nuclear apocalypse training. How is the story? Before continuing, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and turn on the notification, guys. The film begins with two people who are farming. A woman named Petra and her boyfriend named James. Petra immediately rushed to go to campus, while James had continued his sleep, so he was late to campus. In a panic, he rushed and ran towards his campus, where it could be seen that he was in Indonesia. Finally, he arrived at his campus. Luckily, the lecturer had not closed the door. This campus is an international school in Jakarta taught by a lecturer named Dr. Zimit who focuses on philosophy. This campus has been established for 20 years and there are 20 students studying there, where they all come from various countries. Now it was time for them to graduate, and this was their last day of studying here. Dr. Zimit then tested their knowledge of thinking as their mental preparation for facing the future. Initially, Zimit gave the students the opportunity to show their hands and asked them to present the extent of their logic. One student gave an illustration by analogizing 5 people on a track where a train was about to run over them all. Then the track was diverted to another direction where only one person might be the victim and die. Although both choices were bad, he had to choose the best. A student named Utami presented how to test loyalty, namely by falling from a tower and asking for help from her friends. With that, she could test who was brave enough to sacrifice and who was unwilling to take risks. Of course, the loyal one would be left behind. Hearing all their presentations, Zimit felt dissatisfied because their logic was still basic and not fully in-depth. Of course, Zimit wanted to test their logical abilities in depth. Initially, Zimit asked them to think about finding the safest area when post-apocalyptic strikes. After long deliberation, finally the students chose Indonesia. Because this region has a friendly climate and, of course, easily accessible natural resources for survival. Zimit asked the students to focus on imagining that they were currently in Java, specifically in Prambanan, which had been surrounded by a nuclear bomb explosion. Zimit took out his radiology equipment and imagined that he had built an underground bunker right under the Pura Sagittara temple. He chose this location because the stones in the temple proved to be very old and sturdy enough for shelter. He brought all the students into the bunker with sophisticated sensors and a glass door made specifically for the explosion. The goal was so they could monitor the outside conditions. Furthermore, this bunker was designed very luxuriously and had food reserves that could sustain life for a year. However, the problem was that the supplies in this bunker were only enough for 10 people. There were also only 10 oxygen cylinders available, and oxygen must be used when disaster struck. However, Zimit emphasized that the disaster would last for 1 year. If the oxygen was shared, then they would only survive for half a year, and of course they would all end up dead. They went outside to see the nuclear dust that was getting closer, and they only had 1 hour. There was only one option they had to take: to get rid of those who were unworthy to enter. Zimit then compared them to having different professions, and from that profession, they could determine who was useful and who was not. They all introduced their professions, according to the cards that Zimmet had randomly distributed. After hearing all their professions, Zimmet immediately killed one of the students because he only had the profession of employee. Petra was hysterical seeing the murder. However, Zimmet explained that it was better for him to die quickly than to let his skin peel off due to radiation. To be fair, Petra suggested voting and deliberation. Everyone expressed their opinions regarding their strengths and functions. For example, Georgina, who is a doctor and expert in the health field. Of course, she is very much needed for survival and is useful in the future. Then James, who works as a farmer, is certainly very much needed too. Petra, who has expertise in electronics, is also very much needed. Then others like Reyes, whose profession is only a guitar player. Of course he is useless to anyone. So he was set aside. One of the students asked Zimmet why he didn't participate in the voting. He also emphasized that he was like the owner of the bunker. And only Zimmet knew how to operate it. After the voting, finally 11 people were successfully eliminated. 10 other people were officially elected, including Zimmet, Utami, Petra, and James. Not long after, the nuclear dust got closer, and along with the sound of gunfire, everyone gathered and witnessed the murder of 11 people carried out by Zimmet. Where he reasoned that he helped them die rather than be exposed to radiation. Petra did not like seeing Zimmet's arbitrary actions. They should have consulted first before killing. Now Petra has ordered her boyfriend, James, to get rid of Zimmet. James secretly told everyone to carry out a plan to get rid of Zimmet. The bunker door was opened by Zimmet. But when he went out for a moment, the students suddenly locked it from the inside so that Zimmet was trapped outside. James closed the glass door, and all those who were chosen immediately did whatever they wanted. Inside there, they began to be confused, seeing new objects that they did not know. They all slept where that night the conditions outside had been exposed to nuclear radiation. Petra, curious about the conditions outside, then she went to the front to look at it through the glass. Well, Zimmet appeared, whose skin had been blistered by radiation. Then weakly he showed a sign that said only he knew the key code to open the glass door. Petra immediately panicked and called his friends. Here James began to worry. What if the door really could not be opened after a year had passed? However, the other students who still hated Zimmet believed that Zimmet must be lying. They also did not dare to open the door for now because the radiation was still spread in the air. Currently their only choice was to wait until 1 year had passed. Their days went by as usual. Meanwhile, Petra could only stare at Zimmet's body that was starting to rot. They did everything without rules. So before even 1 year their food reserves were exhausted. James and the others finally decided to leave the bunker. They did everything they could to break through the glass door. But the door remained strong. They all regretted just getting rid of one person because of emotion. Now many people became victims. Of course, in the end they died of starvation. They ultimately failed the first logic test. Zimmet advised them to think more critically before taking action. Even though they already knew that Zimmet owned the bunker, they still had the heart to get rid of him for just one mistake. Here, the students learned a lesson from the first illustration. Zimmet then began the second illustration, set on Mount Bromo. He still played the role of the bunker owner with the authority to regulate. Meanwhile, the profession cards distributed previously contained additional details. For example, Georgina was previously selected to enter the banker due to her profession as a doctor. However, her subsequent explanation stated that she contracted the Ebola virus while treating a patient and was rejected from entering the banker due to its potential to kill survivors. Meanwhile, Petra and James were still selected. Although James works as a farmer, he is a cheerful person. However, he will still be useful for managing crops in the future. Everyone introduced themselves to their professions and additional histories. The other students who were not selected ultimately chose to escape by car rather than be shot by Zim. However, they all ultimately died in the nuclear explosion. Meanwhile, Zimmet and the selected students immediately entered the banker. In the banker, their job is to reproduce, which is absolutely essential for the continuation of the human population. One night, Petra imagined how James could become a guy in this illustration, and Petra saw James shaving his bow with Jack. Seeing that, Petra was jealous. But James tried to explain that this was just an illustration. They all talked about their respective partners. Where in this banker there were only 6 men and 4 women. Finally, it was officially determined that there were 4 couples except James, because Guy was of course paired with another man. They began to reproduce that night, where Petra was forced to pair up with Zimmet. Of course, this would increase James's jealousy as Petra's real boyfriend. After 10 weeks without pregnancy, Zimmet argued that they needed to change partners. They had to work together to contribute mucus until they succeeded in conceiving. However, one of the students named Boney rejected Zimmet's decision because he still had self-respect and didn't want to accept any man they wanted. Hearing this rejection, Zimmet became angry. Then he locked the group up, leaving only Bonnie, who was ready to be killed. Zimmet then began aiming for her head. Luckily, Jack was left behind and saw Zimmet's action, so he immediately attacked him before he fired his gun. Zimmet and Jack fought, where Jack used a pencil to stab Zimmet's ear until he finally died. Knowing that he was going to die, Zimmet rushed to open the glass door code. The goal was of course to kill everyone until they all died in a nuclear explosion. The students again failed to pass this second illustration. Seeing this failure, James began to suspect Zimmet and asked what Zimmet's real motive was in doing this group illustration. James said that the students were always blamed in this illustration. Then he asked about Zim's strange behavior when distributing the roll cards randomly. Zimmy also started to act awkwardly when James asked him. James quickly took the city, where he exposed all the lies in this illustration. It turned out that the profession cards had been arranged by Zimmet so he could give the students the roles he wanted. James felt unfair because the roles should have been chosen randomly, and he was also angry because his role as a guy man, so he was always separated from his girlfriend, Petra. This oddity actually did not only happen once, but also throughout the previous days. James accused Zimmet of deliberately assigning terrible roles to the students he chose, primarily to vent his anger. However, James was also confused because he felt he had no problem with Zimmet. Then one of the students decided to repeat the illustration again, where they had fixed roles but with different rules. Zimmet then chose the Belitung coast area as a hideout for the banker. However, this time Petra begged all the students to give her the opportunity to choose 10 people who were worthy to join the banker. Zimmet once again warned Petra to choose people who only had expertise. However, this time it was the opposite. Petra instead chose people who had never been chosen before and did not have important roles. This of course made Zimmet even more confused. In the end, Petra chose a dozen incompetent people, including James. Zimmet was angry because he was not included in the group, so he immediately looked for his gun. Now there was only one slot left unfilled. However, it turned out that Petra had brought the gun, knowing that Zimmet would definitely shoot them. Confused, Zimmet immediately pointed the gun at James and threatened him to take his place. However, this time James fought back, having already obtained a weapon from the banker. Zimmet threatened in a different way, claiming that only he knew the banker's door code. Bonnie denied this, claiming she already knew the code. When Zimmet committed suicide in the previous game, Zimmet was finally cornered and chose to leave. James then asked Petra to take the last slot. However, Petra refused. She instead chose Chips, who played the role of a sterile man and had no use in the banker. Chips filled the last slot, and Petra chose to stay outside the banker. However, James was dissatisfied with Petra's absence. Petra still refused. Fortunately, Chips called her to give her the ship's keys. But he instead pulled Petra in his place. Petra was finally put into the banker. Meanwhile, Chips headed to the ship to escape with the unselected. Groups were seen surviving in the banker, where they lived freely and without rules. People with deviant skills were finally given the opportunity to entertain. James also always spent time with Petra. Petra explained that the days at the bunker were enjoyable. Although she realized she wouldn't have survived without skilled people, at least she could fill her final days with enjoyment. Less than a year later, they saw the scorching weather outside. They opened the bunker door with the code Bonnie had given them. After leaving, they realized that a nuclear bomb had never exploded in this area. Beyond this illustration, Zimmet refuted Petra's decision that even if the bomb had never fallen there, they would never have been able to leave the island because they were with people who didn't have the skills. Zimmet's opinion was again refuted by Petra. She didn't mind failing to survive, because basically everyone will die. Petra was even grateful if she knew that death would soon approach her. So in the final seconds of her life, she could fill it with good things and gather with the people she loved, instead of being busy avoiding death. The illustration game continued, where the group found a bomb that had fallen but failed to explode. James chose to press the bomb and intended to escape as soon as possible. But Zimmet suddenly came with his gun where he looked weak and dirty. It turned out that he had previously hidden behind a cave and survived in the wild. Zimmet intended to kill James and claimed that James was the cause of human extinction. But for a moment all the students protected him before finally James chose to press the bomb to end their lives. Some students asked, how does the story continue with Chips? Sips then explained that he and a group of women managed to find another island outside the nuclear range. The men who were with him were said to have died foolishly on the island. So now only women live with him. Because he was infertile, of course he needed to work hard to get the women pregnant. So Chips got the best ending with unlimited bowing. The storyline had wild logic according to Zimmet which disappointed him. At the end of the session, everyone left except Petra, who went to Zimit. It turned out that Zimit tried to use the training to punish Petra and James. Now it was revealed that Zimit had a love affair with Petra. Then he claimed that James had stolen Petra from him. After that, Petra said that she preferred James because he was more comfortable with her. Unlike Zim, who is too serious and always prioritizes intelligence, Petra thinks that having intelligence and skills is useless, where all of it is ultimately only used for himself. The most important thing is to help people who don't have the ability and give them a chance. Petra then decided to separate from Zimit. At that time, Zimit was alone at school, where he took a gun and immediately killed himself there. That's the movie After the Dark. In your opinion, what message did you get from this movie? And from 1 to 10, what rating would you give for this movie? If you like the video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and activate the notification, guys. See you in the next video.